You're listening to Haituk Talks, the official podcast of the AYF West. My name is Haig Minasyan, and we're just a couple of Armenians talking in the world.
A couple of Armenians talking in the world.
Alex Galitsky, welcome back to the show. You were part of our original Artsakh series when the war began in 2020, let's say, and then and here we are 3-4 years later, and Artsakh is no longer an existing state in a sense. But with that being said, it's still relevant and still part of our missions and goals and part of our reality. It's still real in that sense. However, back then you were working for the ANC Western region, but now you're in DC working for ANC National or ANC DC. But could you tell us a little bit about your roles and responsibilities currently at the Armenian National Committee in DC?
Sure, yeah. Now at ANC DC, along with my colleagues, I handle our legislative affairs, so political lobbying, our engagement with congressional officers, policy, legislative work in general, in addition to things here and there with our youth programs too. But we are working day in, day out on advancing legislative priorities to support the refugees from Artsakh, to try to guarantee a safe right to return for Armenians to Artsakh, and also I think most importantly, to hold Azerbaijan accountable for its aggression and ethnic cleansing of Artsakh.
So you're working closely with the policymakers, the congressmen that are in D.C. at that time, many of our own local congressmen here in California, and working with them on passing resolutions and bills like that. And I'll say there's no better person for that job. I mean, you're excellent at those things. No, I mean, for reals, and it's I'm happy that we have you there. We're very fortunate as a community to have you working for us, in a sense, for our communities.
We'll cut this part.
No. We love Alex. That being said, the transition, or not really transition, but when you're working out here, you're working with local politics, you're working with the local congressman on, let's say, on Californian issues or the Californian Armenian community. But now in DC, you're more in the federal / global policy of the United States. Have you noticed any differences? Not that you have preferences or you like one or the other, but how has that experience been now, shifting towards more a national and international policy stage versus the local work they used to do?
I mean, the local work is really essential because we need to keep our community centers open. We need to get money into the programs that we offer, youth development, social services, whatever it might be. So it's very important that work be done locally. It's important to engage the grassroots of the community, so the local ANC chapters, AYF chapters. It's absolutely essential, but we also have to understand that there are limits to what you can do locally and at the state level when it comes to Artsakh and Armenia. Right. So we can pass resolutions at the State Assembly that criticize Azerbaijan's actions and call for the federal government to take certain actions, but at the end of the day, those decisions are being made in Congress. So It's definitely a different environment. You're also dealing with different interests. I mean, here in California, where you have 1 million Armenians, no member of the assembly is going to look at you and say, no, I'm not going to support this issue. But then when you go to Congress, you're competing with special interests, you're competing with geopolitical considerations, you're competing with the administration and the State Department. So it's a very different dynamic.
Congressmen who don't have Armenian constituents in their areas and learning about Armenians for the first time and having to explain all that from fresh, whereas here we have that privilege of them knowing our issues and our cause and the Armenian genocide and so on. I mean, if I could, if there had to be one Armenian community in the U.S. that I think should be growing, I personally think we should all be moving to DC and just flood that place with Armenians. For that purpose, you're saying that it is internationally tangible versus, let's say, within the state, we're kind of limited to our own places. However, even with, the ANC and all our community orgs have done a really good job of creating partnerships, making relationships with these congressmen and legislative people throughout the years. I feel like we have a lot of friends in Congress, and even with all those friends and the hard work that we've put in and all our grassroots activities, it still wasn't enough, right, to stop the ethnic cleansing and the genocide of Artsakh. It wasn't enough to stop the war, and it almost feels like we're maxed out in terms of our capacity to make change or to push back on those special interest groups that are unfortunately really what's running our foreign policy. I mean, how do you feel about that? And I mean, is that challenge surmountable in the sense that, or what, what are we working on? What are some tangible outcomes that we can have in the future? How do you feel about that?
Sure. I mean, one last point on the local front is that all of that work that's being done locally, whether it be for local city councils or the state assembly, whatever it might be, contributes in a very important way to building up civic activism in our community and motivating people to do work. And to your point about where we could be making more of a difference, I don't think it's just in DC. I think it's also in bolstering our communities outside of California, because we have a very strong presence here. But, I've had the privilege of working over the course of the last couple of years with our grassroots from across the country. And I'll tell you, places like Texas, there's a budding community and there's a lot of work that can be done there. Nevada is extremely important, especially in the context of the federal election, because it's a swing state, as is Michigan, where we have a large community, Pennsylvania, where we have a large community. Areas outside of SoCal, even Northern California, there's a lot of potential there. So it's important we keep on building our capacity across the board. But kind of to your immediate question, I mean, yeah, we all feel this, right? We all feel like we've been shouting into the void for years, and I think it's natural that people are going to look at the work of the ANC and other advocacy groups and think, what's the return on this? Like, we've been doing this work for so long, we've been building these relationships for so long. Why is it that we haven't seen any movement? And I think you kind of allude to a point about just insurmountable obstacles. The big one is geopolitics, special interests, energy interests. Yeah. What I'll say is we're not blind to that, right? We are very, very aware that geopolitics is really the main consideration that the US government is playing out when it comes to the region, right? The idea that human rights and democracy and these values that the US claims to promote ever had anything to do with decision making is an absolute joke, right? Yeah. And I think we kind of appeal to those values because we're on the right side of history, right? We stand for these principles and values, but we realistically know that there's a difference between us saying that publicly and using that as messaging, but then what really is moving the gears behind the scene, right? And the US has used human rights and democracy as a kind of window dressing for its geopolitical adventurism. Countries. Yeah, I mean, look, but you're right. Yeah, the invasion of Iraq, like that was in part kind of sold to the public as being about this brutal dictatorship. And what did that do? It destabilized the region for years.
And it was energy interests after all,
and
right?
It was all about energy interests. Or Syria, right? It was about toppling this brutal authoritarian regime that was persecuting its people. And in the aftermath of that, we had ISIS. Or Libya, and toppling its brutal dictatorship. And in the aftermath of that, we have now like the largest slave market in the world.
But it's not even like destabilizing these countries. It's also then turning a blind eye to those dictatorships that do exist and they're our allies, and then ignoring their human rights violations and those it goes not just those kind of policies, but also upholding dictators like Aliyev, who are supposedly against everything that we stand for. You'd think it'd be an easier case for winning over our policymakers, and I'm sure a lot of them do understand that. But
I'll get into the kind of the differences there. The point I'd say about like do we feel like there's still progress to be made, and is there still a path forward? I mean, the answer is unequivocally yes. And I mean, none of us would be doing the work that we do if we thought that there was no progress, if we didn't believe in it. I mean, I think at their core, every activist or advocate is maybe a hopeless optimist who really believes in those values and ideas and thinks that it's important to try to make change. I mean, if you look at the civil rights movement and everything that's come since then, these victories wouldn't have happened if these people were, saw the first obstacle and said, well, we can't overcome that. They were fighting against an entire system, right? And we have to realize we're also fighting against the system. We face, and our biggest challenge, we can talk about it more later, is the State Department and the administration that has vested geopolitical interests that conflict with our goals and objectives and aspirations as a people. But what we do have is, in the United States, a separation of powers. And our work in the congressional space, while it may not always yield the results that we would like to see, also remains the only option we have to, enforce a check and balance on executive overreach. So we have in our community a massive resource, right? I've said this before, maybe even on the last podcast, but Azerbaijan has oil and we have a diaspora, right? Yeah. That's our natural resource. That's our greatest asset. That's where we can make a difference and really compel change. And that's the space that we're working in. And we also have to understand that we are not the only ones that are going to be making a difference in this space, right? The ANCA has a part to play, as does every other community organization here in the US and around the world, right? Everyone has to play their part in order for us to see the outcomes that we want. So maybe the measure is, what would the landscape look like if there wasn't an Armenian advocacy presence in DC? How much worse would it be?
Yeah.
How much less attention would these issues be getting? So we have to understand there are limitations on what we can do based on the geopolitical environment that we're in, based on the administrations that we're dealing with, and these are things that we just need to account for.
But it sounds like you guys are aware of those limitations, and you're building your strategies and to counter or to work around those barriers. And so, I mean, in the near future, what are some, let's say, projects or some of those strategies that you guys are looking to employ? What can the diaspora support you guys, like the rest of the communities, be focused on, let's say, over the next year?
One of the big things is what tools exist right now in the U.S. to reassert congressional oversight and authority over decision-making, right? Because in the environment we're in now, and this has been the case for like the last 20 years, U.S. governments have a lot of power to direct military assistance, spending, arms sales. All these things kind of have fallen outside of the purview of Congress. And by virtue of that, they've fallen outside of the purview of democratic debate. Yeah. Because the State Department and administration are extremely impervious to democratic input.
Yeah.
So, and it's a sad thing to say, but that's just the case. Because members of Congress are beholden to the interests of their constituents, right? And they can represent honestly the views of those constituents. In some cases, they represent honestly the views of their donors, and that's.
But here we are as like Armenian Americans, like trying to do the right way of like doing democracy, And
but that's kind of the thing, and I think while it may not have a lot of weight in the geopolitical debate, we do have a strong moral argument and moral authority, right? And I'd say this, When we were fighting for genocide recognition, there came a point where you could ask any member of Congress if they believed that the genocide happened, and they would all say yes. No one would deny it to your face. They may not support the recognition for geopolitical reasons, which I think we eventually overcame, but they recognized the moral value in what we were doing. And I think we're at a place right now, right? With the momentum that we were able to build over the course of the last year, no, it didn't translate into tangible outcomes, but in terms of legislation and curtailing assistance to Azerbaijan. But we are at a point where the support for Artsakh and Armenia is unprecedented.
They're aware of it. They know what's happening.
Not only are they aware of it, I mean, one of the resolutions that we'd introduced very, very early on during the blockade that we worked with the leaders of the Armenian Congressional Caucus on had, I think, over 100 co-sponsors by the time the ethnic cleansing happened, right?
Yeah.
Now, it seems like a very shallow thing to point out now after everything that's happened, but 1/4 of Congress basically was saying Azerbaijan has to lift the blockade and the U.S. should cut military assistance to Azerbaijan. Why didn't that go anywhere? It's not because of a want of effort on our part. Maybe it's because Congress is very limited in the authority that it has, and maybe more so it's because the administration was doing everything it could to prevent those conversations and debates from happening. So there was unprecedented support. Even after the ethnic cleansing happened, there was a letter that was led by the most senior Democrat on the Armed Services Committee, which is a very, very significant committee, who led a congressional letter that had, I think, 100 co-sponsors on both the Senate and the House side trying to impose sanctions on Azerbaijan, right? This was like within days of the ethnic cleansing happening. So there's a lot of momentum right now. And that's something that we need to capitalize on.
Are there are we unique in this capacity that we've built over the last, let's say, a few decades or years? Are there other instances of groups like ours in DC? Like, I wouldn't even say we're, let's say, successful, but it seems like we've really built up something here that's that we can work with.
Yeah.
And I mean, are we seeing other like examples of this right now? Are we a unique case where we've really built something up?
I'll give you an interesting example. I think, well, anecdotally, a friend of mine who works in the kind of foreign policy space, progressive foreign policy space, who's worked a lot in cutting, U.S. assistance to Saudi Arabia and the Yemen war, said when he worked on the Hill, he came to a genocide commemoration event that we were hosting where there were like 20 members of Congress lining up to speak. And he said, I've never seen anything like that in terms of just the way in which you're able to mobilize members of Congress in support of your issue. And he said, you guys have such a good infrastructure as a community. How do you keep on losing?
Yeah,
right?
That's what I was about to say is we're so, like, it seems like on paper we have everything you would need to get legislation passed or to have this influence, but it's not, coming into fruition. So, and so to kind of come back to what you were saying a little earlier about the balance of power of things, so let's say we have Congress and they're in support. They see the just and the truth in the issue, but the State Department and the president, because of whatever reasons, they're withholding any sort of tangible outcomes. How do we, what is, let's say, in your opinion, or the ANC's plan on trying to work around that, or
So right now, I guess just to get into the legislation, and it's going to get a little wonky, but one of the things we have moving in the Senate right now is a request for an investigation into Azerbaijan's human rights abuses. Right. It seems kind of innocuous because we all know Azerbaijan perpetrated abuses, but the reality is that there's not been a formal investigation conducted into those war crimes that were perpetrated.
On the federal level of our nation.
Yeah. Something on the record, something that's recent and targeted, right? So there's this provision of law called Section 502B of the Foreign Assistance Act. And this law was passed back in the 60s and hasn't really been successfully enforced, which is a whole other story. But basically it says the U.S. cannot send military assistance to countries engaged in a pattern of human rights abuses. And then there are a whole load of caveats, like, except when it's in the national security interest of the U.S. There's always some kind of a waiver clause in there that
maybe they'll try to pull that on us, but
anyway, what this resolution would do, though, there's a mechanism in place. So you introduce the resolution, the 502B resolution requesting the report. If that is able to pass, then the State Department has 30 days to provide a report on Azerbaijan's abuses. If that report isn't provided within those 30 days, all assistance to Azerbaijan is automatically cut.
And the State Department can't override that
until they provide that report. So if it be 35 days later, maybe we cut aid for 5 days. That's not the point. When the report is provided, you can then go through a second vote process through a joint session of Congress. Prohibit, terminate, limit, whatever the assistance to Azerbaijan. And what makes this really powerful is when we introduce resolutions, typically what happens is the resolution goes to a committee. It sits in the committee until that committee chair decides they're going to allow it to go to a vote, right? And then the leader of either the House or the Senate has the authority to schedule that for a vote. So there are two stages where it can be held up. The committee can say, we don't want to hear this and just let it die in committee. Or they'll send it up the chain and then it dies before it can reach the floor for a vote, right?
Yeah.
But this resolution is privileged, which means we can just force a vote. Yeah. After 10 days of being in committee, we can discharge it from the committee and force a vote and make those members of Congress take a position. Nice. And they have no choice. So this mechanism means we're getting around the administrative bureaucracy of Congress, but also means that we are able to force the administration's hand and put them in a position where they need to respond to our requests.
Address it, look into it.
We're not at the mercy of them, right?
They have
a timeline, they have to respond.
If they have intentions on keeping that military aid going to Azerbaijan or whatever, then they're going to have to write this report. But what are the chances that the reports, they put a really good effort into the report and it and they don't try to put something out there that are we who's involved in that? Is that on their end and we just have to hope that they have a thorough report on human rights abuses?
If you look already, the State Department does reporting on every country, and if you look at Azerbaijan's report, it's really it's not a glowing representation of Azerbaijan, right? It highlights all of these abuses. It's very clear that Azerbaijan's in the wrong. It would also require the US to explain why they keep sending assistance in light of all these abuses, but notwithstanding the outcome of a report, we can still force a second vote.
Nice.
Right? But we expect that they'll come back with a report that basically says, yes, Azerbaijan did all these things. Yes, that's in violation of our own human rights standards, but it's still necessary for us to send assistance. And then we'll say, well, that's up to Congress to adjudicate on. So to the point that you were making about how do we overcome the kind of administrative the administration's block or the State Department's block is you just go through them.
Yeah.
Right?
In a bill like this.
And you use Congress's built-in oversight role to hold the administration accountable. It's very, very powerful. And I'll say on this that we have a very large group of organizations that have sponsored this initiative, endorsed the initiative, including Amnesty International, Freedom House, Human Rights Foundation, the National Council of Churches, which represents 35 to 40 million Christians in the country. Like, we're talking significant support because these groups are all thinking this is a way for us to reassert Congress's role over military assistance and democratizing that process so that it's not just an arbitrary decision by the State Department or whoever's in power, that Congress has the final say. And we win when we bring those conversations back into democratic debate, when we can allow things like morality and democracy and these sorts of value-based considerations to determine policy outcomes, not these cynical, self-interested geopolitical considerations that hurt us.
No, that's very interesting, and it gets me a little excited to think that we're breaking ground or getting the interest of these other groups through our example or through our efforts. They're seeing some form of inspiration or whatever through our work. And it's a credit to you guys. To be able to bring in all these groups together from different sides of the aisle as well, not just the congressmen, So it sounds like it has this been like, have things like this been enacted or worked before, like similar to this bill you're talking about? Is this unprecedented in a sense that hasn't been done in a minute? Like, why are they keen to see us as this test subject?
Well, I'll put it like this. The last time a request for a report was successful was 1976.
Vietnam.
It's been a while. Yeah. It's been a long time. There have been other attempts, but I would call them more messaging attempts. So last year, a similar resolution was brought against Saudi Arabia. And the idea wasn't necessarily to cut assistance to Saudi Arabia. It was to bring the conversation, send a message and bring the conversation out into the open. Let's have an honest debate about the U.S. relationship with the Saudis. Mm-hmm. Senator Sanders also recently introduced one with regards to Israel, which the ANC endorsed. In principle, we support any effort to ensure congressional oversight over arms sales. That was unsuccessful, but it was also the first time, I believe, in recent memory, this has even been brought to the floor for a vote. So It would be unprecedented if we did it. And I think some of these groups, the reason they're looking to us and saying, wow, this could actually be successful, is because they've seen the significant congressional momentum behind Armenian issues, and they believe that there might be the support. And one good example of this is recently, like in November of last year, there was Senate Bill 3000, which passed. And Senate Bill 3000, it passed the Senate with unanimous support. That resolution said that it would prohibit the president from waiving Section 907. So, recap, Section 907 was the law passed in the 1990s that said the U.S. will send no assistance to Azerbaijan because of its aggression against Armenia and Artsakh, right? 2002, in the wake of 9/11 and in support of the U.S. military operations and invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq, they wanted to find ways to, bring partners in across the region. And Azerbaijan was positioned in a good location, right? So they wanted to find a way to get money back in. So they said, we'll introduce a waiver authority to Section 907 that gives the president the authority to send assistance to Azerbaijan whenever it's deemed in the national security interest of the U.S. And every single president since then has waived 907, so has sent assistance to Azerbaijan. The biggest single block of assistance was under Trump. It was $120 million in aid to Azerbaijan right before the 2020 war. We've seen hundreds of millions of dollars go in defense contracts to Azerbaijan, arms sales, all these sorts of things. So this is something that we've seen successively year on year on year. But this bill in the Senate, S3000, would prohibit the president from exercising that authority.
And that passed?
And it passed. And because it was passed by a unanimous consent motion, just any one member of the Senate could have got up and said, I oppose this, and not a single one did.
Which is amazing, too.
And we know there was opposition. We know that there was opposition from the State Department. They put a lot of pressure on senators to oppose it. It still passed with unanimous consent. So what that tells me is there are plenty of people who are extremely frustrated with how the administration turned a blind eye to what Azerbaijan did and are looking for opportunities to hold them accountable. And that gives me an indication that maybe we can do this with the 502B request. Maybe we can have a successful vote on the floor of the Senate. It's still going to take some work for us to get there. I mean, technically, the bill has been in committee for 10 days, so it can be discharged at any point now, and we can force a vote at any point, but we're still building support. I think we have about 12 members of the Senate who are supporting it at this stage.
What is the timeline like? Since we're recording this in February, when this comes out, who knows? But what is the timeline like for this? When did you guys put it in? When is it expected to?
It was introduced on the 1st of February. The earliest it could have been discharged from committee was like earlier this week. Theoretically, it could have passed by the time this podcast is released. It's really just it's hard to say. These things move quickly. Ironically, getting to this point was a very slow process. And I know a lot of people say, well, you're doing this all after ethnic cleansing has already happened. The reality is that some of these things have been in the works for a year. Yeah. And it takes a long time to get the ball rolling on having something introduced. So we're at a point now where the best we can get out of this is to send a deterrent to Azerbaijan against further military action against Armenia, and also try to shift U.S. policy towards Azerbaijan so we can start talking about things like, no, we shouldn't have a Zangezur corridor. Maybe we should be talking about a secure right to return for Artsakh Armenians to their homes, you know? So think of it as like a starting point for us to open the door for these conversations that are already being had, but this is the major obstacle right now. The U.S. can't be on the right side of history so long as it's continuing to send assistance to Azerbaijan.
So there are things to be done from what it sounds, but we've kind of like talked. We've gone over this geopolitical interest in the region, and I was wondering if you could kind of elaborate, just indeed, like talk about what from your opinion, from you being in DC, what is it that they see for the value of Azerbaijan that's worth it for them to keep supporting them like this? Why are we having so much trouble convincing them that they're bad guys? Because they are bad guys.
There are a lot of reasons why the U.S. did nothing, and I'll try to cover some of them.
Yeah.
Geopolitics is obviously a big one. Azerbaijan borders Russia and Iran, two big U.S. rivals, right?
Yeah.
And the U.S. has, for a long time, seen Azerbaijan as a kind of important geopolitical asset to contain these two powers.
Same thing with Turkey, by the way.
And same thing with Turkey and the reasons for its NATO membership as well initially. The thing is, though, Azerbaijan's utility is kind of maybe illusory, we could say, because we know Azerbaijan has very strong energy ties with Russia and Iran, and these things are kind of conveniently brushed aside. We don't want to talk about it right now because the more immediate interests are post-invasion of Ukraine, Azerbaijani oil to Europe, right? Oil and gas to Europe. This didn't start in 2022 or after the 2020 war. It started decades ago when the US and the UK and others started pumping billions of dollars into developing these pipelines. We know that Clinton was a very, very strong supporter politically of Azerbaijan's pipeline projects. Wanted to incentivize U.S. companies to invest in Azerbaijan. BP is the main operator of the big gas field in Azerbaijan in the UK. So there are a lot of vested economic interests as well that play a big factor, I think, in decision making. Yeah. But the reality is that Europe's in a position where it feels like it can't be, beggars can't be choosers when it comes to who they get their gas from. Even if it's ironic that they're replacing their reliance on one dictatorial authoritarian expansionist regime with another one in Azerbaijan. Also, because Azerbaijan contributes maybe at best 3% of Europe's energy needs, and probably even less than that. And also that Azerbaijan doesn't really have the capacity to do that because its own extractive capacity isn't where it needs to be in order to meet Europe's needs. So that's why we see Azerbaijan buying a lot of Russian oil and gas to meet domestic needs while it exports its gas to Europe. And that basically just means Russian gas is going to Europe.
They're substituting.
It makes it's fungible. It makes absolutely no difference where the origin of the gas was. If Europe's getting more gas because Azerbaijan's getting theirs from Russia, that's the equivalent. It's basically a recycling operation.
You're still paying Russia one way or another. There's a middleman now.
And Russia and Iran both own like large stakes in Azerbaijan's gas fields. Too, so I mean, this is obviously something that we talk about with a lot of members, and a lot of them don't know. In fact, we had a hearing in November of last year, I think it was November, where a member of Congress who actually just introduced the House version of that Senate bill that passed, and we can talk about it a little bit later, and he asked the administration official who was there, "Are you aware of Azerbaijan's energy ties with Russia and Iran?" And he said, "Yes, I am." And then the follow-up question, do you believe this is consistent with U.S. security interests in the region? And the official said, no, they're not. Anyway, let's move on. And that was the end of the conversation. They're fully aware of it. And that's the point I want to make. The U.S. is very aware of everything that's happening. There were a couple of New York Times articles after the war where they said, how could anyone have known this was going to happen? And the reality is, everyone knew this was going to happen.
Yeah, I mean...
When 5 days before the attack on Artsakh, there was a Senate Foreign Relations Committee hearing where the Assistant Secretary for Europe and Eurasia said, we will not tolerate ethnic cleansing of Artsakh. We will not tolerate military action against the Armenians of Artsakh, right? Why do you think she chose that time after the State Department for months and months and months were dodging public hearings, dodging responses to Congress members who were sending in letters? Why then? Do you think it's a coincidence that 5 days later Azerbaijan launched an attack? That was the US trying to say, we know what's coming, and we're giving you a very stern public warning not to do it. But they absolutely knew that a violent attack on Artsakh was imminent, and they were trying to, in a very, very, soft way, tell them to
deter them,
to cool it down.
You don't think it was them trying to, remove the blame from themselves, like trying to save their own butts?
That's absolutely part of it as well. So then they can, after the fact, say, we tried, we did what we could. But anyway, that's kind of preempting other discussions. So there's the geopolitics of it, Russia, Iran. Obviously with Iran as well, you have the attempts to cut Iran out and enforce sanctions on Iran. You have security issue. You have the Israel factor.
I'm sure that didn't help. I mean, that hasn't helped. Ukraine didn't help, and then what's going on in Israel-Palestine right now is not obviously helping either.
Yeah, I mean, right now, you got to think that in the minds of the State Department people, they're thinking, well, Israel really doesn't have many allies in the region, but Azerbaijan gets 70% of their weapons from Israel and sells Israel about 40% of its gas, right?
Yeah,
so
they're a partner.
They don't want to close the door in cooperation with Azerbaijan while there's a risk of broader regional confrontation. I think the geopolitics explains some of it in terms of the regional dynamic. I think part of the reason that the U.S. took the position that it did is because, well, the U.S. has forfeited over the last 20 years its role as a negotiating partner, right? The U.S. really hasn't played the role that it was meant to under the OSCE Minsk group to try to negotiate a solution, right? Yeah. And then I think there was a big failure in 2020 when they let Russia totally monopolize that ceasefire process after, right? Russia got to send peacekeepers in. They got to control the checkpoints. They de
facto were the mediators in that situation.
Exactly. So the U.S. now sees its role in this negotiation process as trying to take something away from Russia. They want to establish themselves as the regional power brokers. They want to be the ones who make peace, and they want the post-conflict region to be one that's U.S. friendly. And maybe that means not having Russian border guards monitoring things going through southern Armenia from Azerbaijan to Turkey. Because a big thing that's in the head of the US right now, and I've heard this from conversations I've had on the Hill, is, well, right now Azerbaijan's relying on Iran to get to Nakhchivan, right? But we don't want Azerbaijan to rely on Iran. We would much rather Azerbaijan go through Armenia to connect Turkey to the Caspian Sea, to Central Asia, maybe also to kind of establish a block of Russia's north-south corridor,
cut them off from each other. But
so that's another thing that they're considering.
Also, and that's counter to that's the Zangezur corridor in other words. But that's going to debilitate. That's going to destroy southern Armenia. And
it would be an absolute security nightmare.
So here's something that is from what it sounds like is in the interest of the U.S. foreign policy, but not in the interest of the Armenian nation. And how do we work on that? Like how do you approach something like that where you're like, it's not in the best interest of you, but it's the right thing to do is to go against your own interests. You know what I mean? Like it's probably a tough task to try to convince things that are not economically or militarily.
Yeah,
strategy,
exactly. I mean, this was also a challenge when we're trying to make the case for Artsakh self-determination, right? There's also just a lack of political will in the U.S. to do anything good in the region. Artsakh was an inconvenience geopolitically, right?
Armenians are an inconvenience.
Armenians
for everybody.
Well, because the State Department and the administration just sees Armenia through the lens of Russia and or Iran. We're not like our own thing. We're just, we're the collateral damage of U.S. foreign policy to Russia and Iran.
We're all still referred to as
post-Soviet states. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we're just all grouped together. But it was an inconvenience, right? The U.S. saw Azerbaijan's actions as intolerable, right? It's very hard to have an ally that's engaged in really gross human rights violations, and stand by them. They wanted to see this resolved in a way that would avoid the embarrassment of the US dealing with a regime that, based on most metrics, is just as bad as Russia, Iran, China, all these countries that are, US rivals, right? Yeah. But also from the perspective of like the view of Armenia and the way the US looked at Armenia, in the context of Ukraine, it's very hard to make a case for against Azerbaijan's territorial integrity when you're talking about territorial integrity of Ukraine.
Right.
And then some people will bring up like the Kosovo example and how the US was like instrumental in Kosovo's independence. But this is kind of going back to what I said at the beginning. You could use the self-determination, democracy, human rights as a justification for intervening to preserve Kosovo and then its independence. But really, it was about breaking up Yugoslavia and making sure that Serbia didn't play a strong role in the region, right? That was the... And I fully support Kosovo, right? Yeah. But I understand the reasons for why the US acted the way it did were purely in self-interest. So there's no parallel there for us. But for the US, I think what they would have liked to have seen would have been an Armenian-populated Artsakh with some like soft guarantees with... Azerbaijan being in control administratively. Yeah. And then you have free commerce and flow and exchanges through the region. And you have this neoliberal paradise where Turkey can come to the Caspian Sea and bring in oil and gas from Central Asia. Like this was their vision.
And we have a McDonald's in every corner throughout the South Caucasus. It sounds amazing.
Yeah. And then on top of that, I think to your point about, are we asking the U.S. to kind of go against its own interests in that sense, right? Yeah. Is obviously we don't see it that way, but if you're looking at it purely from the reptile in the State Department, right? Yeah. This is how they're thinking about it. The U.S. like it didn't want to use the levers that it did have to constrain Azerbaijan's behavior, right? The U.S. uses sanctions. The U.S. cuts military assistance to other countries. They impose arms embargoes. They have the tools. They didn't want to do it because they thought it would push Azerbaijan into Russia's hands.
To push them away too much.
But we're actually hearing right now that the State Department thinks that with the very minimal stuff that it's done so far, they already feel like they pushed Azerbaijan too far, which is a pathetic thing.
But Azerbaijan will play that up, though. They'll definitely play that card.
They're already doing that. I mean, look, immediately after the ethnic cleansing happened, Azerbaijan signed an energy deal with Russia to transport its gas, transport its crude oil to Turkey to be refined, to then be shipped off and exported. So the idea that, and I think this is the point that we try to make to kind of bring it back around, is maybe Azerbaijan and support for Azerbaijan isn't in the US's interests. Maybe Azerbaijan is playing both sides. Mm-hmm. Maybe they're actually helping Russia evade sanctions and helping Iran evade sanctions and acting in a way that's actually counterintuitive to US interests in the region. And it's the amount of support that the US has given Azerbaijan is kind of disproportionate to what they're getting out of the relationship. And I'll give you an example, very direct example, is for years and years and years, we were told that if the US recognized the genocide, there would be massive repercussions in Turkey with regards to the US. They wouldn't let us use the Incirlik air base. They were going to, the US troops and US expats in Turkey wouldn't be protected. Yeah. And then what happened? The US recognized the genocide. Did any of that unfold?
Right.
So I think there's something kind of like, can Azerbaijan really afford to turn its back on the West?
I was going to say, like, they're playing it up, but I don't know where this lack of confidence from the US is coming from, where they really think that they need to kiss ass around the world for them to like us. Like, we're still the biggest and wealthiest country there is.
Not even that, right? How much of Azerbaijan's economy is oil and gas? And how much of that is now coming from Europe? And with the way that Azerbaijan is developing pipelines and relationships with Europe,
reliant on the West for their
it's becoming increasingly reliant on
you have
Europe.
Leverage, America.
So there is a lot of leverage there, but there's kind of a fear to exert that leverage for I think the points that Azerbaijan is trying to kind of coerce the U.S. into taking a side on this that may not actually be in the interest of the U.S. at all. Mm-hmm. Right? So we're not going to change the geopolitical dynamic, right? We're not going to be able to change that. But what we can do is encourage open debate about the merits of the U.S.-Azerbaijan relationship. And we do that through the resolutions, the hearings, the letters, all these things, where we try to highlight the fact that Azerbaijan isn't a good ally. We've given them way too much when it comes to like goodwill leeway with these negotiations. You know, we keep acting as if they're participating in good faith in these negotiations when they're not. We're giving them way too much benefit of the doubt. and that will at some point come back to bite the US.
Yeah, and I feel like we would love for a very hardcore kind of punishment or whatever you want to call it against Azerbaijan, but I feel like even if like a 5% sanction, like something so small, can really like stop or halt Azerbaijan's aggressive kind of actions and policies.
Well, look, here's the thing. Like, we don't know, right? We don't know if sanctioning Azerbaijani officials and cutting assistance is going to be the deterrent. What I do know is that doing that is going to be a hell of a lot better than continuing to send assistance and continuing to turn a blind eye while they're doing all these abuses.
Right.
It may not be the thing that, like, finally ultimately deters Azerbaijan, but it will be an important thing to stop enabling that behavior on the part of the US. But we need to do that, right? We need to encourage those conversations and debates.
Speaking of conversations and debates, I think it was really interesting to see the AYF and the ANC take some, of our advocacy to the Republican debates and stuff, and the presidential election kind of conversations in those spaces. Because if we can't get, let's say, mainstream politics to talk about it, well, the debates are a hotbed of like national attention and conversations, and right. I know you guys took a lot of creative, like what is it? Not actions, but strategies to kind of engage with these debates. I mean, could you tell us a little bit about like what are the benefits, or what do you see in trying to get Artsakh or our issues for Armenian Americans in the like presidential election conversations and issues?
It's a great question. Obviously, our bread and butter as an organization is this sort of legislative action that we were talking about, but we also realize that in the context of what's going to be a very contentious election in November, that's a tool that we can use as well. And the Biden administration has unequivocally failed, as did the Trump administration. And we're not picking sides there, right? We know that Trump failed by sending assistance and not stopping the war, not exerting any meaningful pressure on Azerbaijan. Biden,
same or worse.
Exact same thing or worse, because he presided over ethnic cleansing. But the format and platform that those debates provide, not just the debates, the action around it, right?
The campaigns and the
and we've often, like, we hear a lot of things in the community about Vivek being, for example, very outspoken on Azerbaijan's crimes, right? Or more recently, RFK Jr., who's polling at like 30-something% nationally, is a very, very, like, depending on whether he gets on the ballot, a very viable third option, right? We're not endorsing these people. They're endorsing our views, right? Vivek is getting up on stages and talking about how the Biden administration failed the Armenians and how the U.S. shouldn't be supporting Azerbaijan's war of aggression, and that how Azerbaijan's ethnic cleansing of Artsakh is representative of the broader failure of U.S. foreign policy across the region, right? And that is an important message for someone who at the time was polling very significantly in the Republican primary to be bringing up in several formats. It wasn't just once or twice. He was speaking about it to the news. He wrote an op-ed for a major publication. He was very outspoken, and getting Artsakh into the national conversation makes it harder and harder for Biden and his campaign to ignore.
No, exactly.
Especially with RFK speaking out about it as well, and then doing a community event here in Glendale, right? Again, he said some very important things. Now, whether or not he's able to enact any of that is not the point, right? Or win is not the point, because that conversation, without what they said publicly, would not be happening at all in the federal arena, right? So just starting those conversations and putting it on the agenda may seem like, not much right now, but it's important because it will at some point get the attention of the campaign.
It's kind of similar to what we were talking about before about getting congressional, like the balance of power between Congress and the State Department. Mm-hmm. This is another way that we are forcing, let's say, the hand of like the Biden and his administration to talk about it. You know?
I mean, another good example of this is, how Arab Americans have been speaking out about the Biden administration's response to Israel's assault on Gaza, right? Mm-hmm. And while we haven't seen like a massive shift in policy, we have seen a change in tone, right? And I put myself in their shoes and say, if we saw a change in tone from Biden on Artsakh during the blockade without any tangible action, we would be rightly frustrated and wouldn't mean anything, right? But at the same time, like, the administration is highly, highly attuned to what's being said now because it knows how close this race is going to be. And that's why when I was talking about building up grassroots capacity in places like Nevada, Michigan, Pennsylvania, where they are swing states, where a couple of hundred, maybe 1,000 votes will determine the outcome. And if Armenians are prepared to vote in line with Artsakh, right? And use Artsakh as their North Star when they make that decision.
It is for me.
And it is for, I think, many, many devoted members in our community. That could actually be a deciding factor. Yeah. So we need to encourage people to show up, but also to vote strategically.
Yeah, because it is interesting to see, like, our numbers might not be big, and I would say, like, to our earlier, like, noting of, like, the capacity that we built up our advocacy, we're not a big, statistically, a huge community, but we're just enough to where we matter, and I think they're starting to realize that in a lot of these areas. It's just, would the Biden administration understand this and like now, or will, even if they play to that, if they try to placate us or appeal to us? Well,
what I can say is they felt the need to placate and appeal to us back in 2020. Right? They came to our community. I remember when I was working with the Western region, there were meetings happening on a very regular basis with his campaign people where they made commitments on paper, written. You can go to the Biden 2020 campaign website where he says, I won't send any military assistance to Azerbaijan. Yeah. Right? So we were significant enough of a constituency to be lied to back then. Yeah. Right? You've got to think right now when he's on a razor's edge margin and there's a real risk of him losing office that they can't afford to squander votes. Joe, we're not going to believe him. But the other thing is where he has a kind of slight, quote unquote advantage is there is currently a humanitarian crisis in Armenia, right? There is a security crisis in Armenia.
There's actionable things.
There are things he can do, right? The other candidates can talk. They can say all they want about Artsakh, right to return, whatever. Biden's the only candidate right now who actually has the ability to act. So there's a higher standard for him, right? We expect that if you want to restore any goodwill with the community, and I can't even guarantee that taking action would do that, you actually have the power to do that right now. You can cut assistance tomorrow. You can impose sanctions tomorrow. You can send, say, U.S. peacekeepers to join the EU mission on the border with Azerbaijan. You can condemn Azerbaijan. There are so many things that could be done to demonstrate that they're taking the concerns of the community seriously. Yeah. And believe me, they know. These people, they're not stupid. They live and breathe this every day. They understand the situation a lot better. When people say, like I mentioned earlier, when people say, oh, they just didn't know or it caught them off guard. No, they made a very calculated cost-benefit analysis and said, well, 120,000 Armenians is the price that we have to pay in order to maintain our relations with Azerbaijan and our position in the region.
XYZ.
And we were the sacrificial lambs for their geopolitical machinations there, right?
I mean, it sounds like there's movement happening. You're now that you're on the ground in DC, you're witnessing firsthand these staffers and these congressmen, what they truly think and how things are really working. And it sounds like there is some optimism in your voice, which is like nice to hear from someone from California with optimism fleeting by the day. What are these, where is it moving? Where do you see it moving? What are these shifts in addition to what we've spoken about? What else could we add to that? I'm curious to where we're kind of what to expect over the next, season. I
mean, look, to your point about optimism, like I said, we have to be optimistic in this. We have to believe that we can make the change because as soon as we stop believing in our ability to make change, we've lost that battle, right? I also very strongly believe that we here in the US or anywhere in the diaspora don't really have the luxury of despair, right? Like we saw this unfolding from a distance and we have the opportunity and the privilege of living in communities where we can make that change. Okay. And we owe it to the people of Artsakh to keep up that struggle and that fight. In terms of where we're going, I mean, these resolutions, I think there's promising momentum behind it. We saw last week that House companion to the Senate bill that would revoke the president's waiver authority over 907 be introduced, which is a good first step. There will be obstacles, but that's why we have these two kind of parallel, not mutually exclusive legislative efforts to kind of cut assistance to Azerbaijan. In terms of where the US is right now, I mean, we have seen some limited change and it's kind of like a tug of war. It's like a push and pull, right? Right after the ethnic cleansing, there was a hearing that took place where the State Department representative said there wasn't going to be business as usual with Azerbaijan. They were going to cancel high-level meetings. They didn't intend to send military assistance to Azerbaijan. Very soft but public commitments. Now, we've seen that kind of collapse because the U.S. ended up resuming high-level meetings not too long after that.
Yeah.
Actually, interestingly enough, Azerbaijan rejected a meeting with the top U.S. negotiator in the region.
Them playing hard to get, and America falls for that crap.
Every single time. And then recently, Azerbaijan was meant to participate in peace talks in Washington D.C.
Right, they didn't come.
And they said they withdrew from those talks, so they never happened. And we saw the same thing happen in, I think it was Brussels last year too.
Yeah.
So Azerbaijan's actually not doing a lot of favors for itself, because with every single one of these actions, and whenever it says we don't need external mediation, we can just hash it out with Armenia between the two of us, that is slowly going to send the signal that they're not good faith actors.
You're not relevant anymore, America. Like, hopefully that is the wake up call there for them, and then they see that they need to take a little bit more action.
And that's where
we're the partner that's actually open to them coming and, having
not
a voice.
Just that. That's where we come in here on the U.S. front as well, and kind of reinforce the message that now you see what we've been saying.
Yes.
Right? Azerbaijan doesn't really care about peace. Why? Because they can get more through war.
Yeah.
The U.S. has given them no indication to believe that they keep warmongering, that they're not going to get what they want. So, and the withdrawal from the peace process, the attack that happened just a couple of days ago that resulted in 5 Armenian soldiers being killed, these things kind of demonstrate that Azerbaijan doesn't really want to play ball. And we need to come in and use this as an opportunity to hammer home the message that we have, through all the letters, the resolutions, the bills, the hearings, the public press conferences, whatever, have exhausted every single possible option. We've done it the right way. We've tried at every turn. We've had meetings with State Department officials. You know what I heard from one State Department official we spoke with?
What? He
said, at the time during the blockade, when asked about whether or not the U.S. was legitimizing Azerbaijan's use of starvation as a negotiating tool, they said, well, starvation isn't the ideal way to get to an agreement. But kind of acknowledging that it was. That's where their heads were at then. We are seeing very incremental changes, and the more that we're able to demonstrate, look, we were telling you this months and months ago, you are now seeing the result of Azerbaijan's actions and intransigence today. It's time for a policy change. Your approach, your method has not worked. It didn't make the region any more stable and safer. It didn't prevent Azerbaijan from committing ethnic cleansing.
They're just as close to Russia and Iran as they ever have been.
There's no return on investment vis-a-vis Russia and Iran.
They haven't pulled away from
what
them.
Are you getting out of this?
Yeah.
We're not even asking you to send troops to the ground. We're saying just cut assistance and enforce your own laws when it comes to sanctioning officials who are complicit in human rights abuses, both domestically and with regards to Artsakh. So those are the sorts of conversations we're starting to have, and I think the points that need to be made.
Can you come up with, or do you have anything in mind that could also play a part in, I don't know, changing kind of their perspective?
It's a tough question. I mean, I think a lot of externalities. Would more media attention help? Yes, absolutely it would. Yeah. It would help in getting the message out there and putting it on the national agenda, because when you're seeing it every day, it becomes intolerable to kind of allow this to happen. So yeah, obviously media is important. On the ground though, I really think this isn't about trying to find the relative cost benefit analysis for the US picking Armenia over Azerbaijan. I think unfortunately there are very strong vested interests in Azerbaijan, right? Yeah. We need to demonstrate where Azerbaijan is a liability right now. That's the most important thing that we can be doing, showing that they're not the ally to the U.S.
Educating them on the risks involved. Yeah. I think that's where the ANC and all our advocacy work is really beneficial to the U.S. is, look, we are experts also in this region. We understand how things work, and we're trying to highlight the truth of the matter, whereas you're trying to be selective with what the reality is. The
methods that we're using as well right now are actually, not only serving the interests of Armenia and the people of Artsakh, they're also addressing this kind of fundamental tension between the executive and the role of congressional oversight. And I think everyone benefits from Congress having a greater say in foreign policy decision-making. It democratizes that process, and it brings in opportunities for other groups that are working in this space to also pursue arms control and other human rights-oriented priorities, like conditioning military assistance on the basis of human rights conditions in countries. So there's a lot that we are kind of contributing to the national conversation too.
Well, so for those elements that I was trying to wanted to pick your brain about. I mean, religious would be one of these other things, or other human rights issues that could overlap, or environmental kind of
actually,
shifts,
I'm glad you mentioned the environmental shifts, because I think another kind of factor that will come into play is COP29 being hosted in Azerbaijan, right? And how did that come about? It was Azerbaijan engaging in hostage diplomacy and telling Armenia, we'll release 32 POWs if you drop your veto over us hosting COP29. But what that's going to mean is a hell of a lot of international media going to Azerbaijan. I'm sure many members of Congress in the US going to Azerbaijan, and an opportunity for us to spotlight human rights abuses. Because, look, the thing was held in UAE last year and Egypt the year before. These are countries engaged in massive abuses. They try to use these sorts of international conventions to, we call it greenwashing, right?
It's greenwashing.
Greenwashing their human rights abuses. But this is another opportunity for us to start hammering Azerbaijan. And we're working with some groups to try to bring up this argument and say, Azerbaijan is very clearly just trying to use this as a smokescreen to whitewash its abuses. Yeah. So that's something that I think's also really important. And then to the other points, we are as an organization and as a community, I think one that unites some very we make strange bedfellows, right?
Yeah, we're very
we're Big Tent, right?
We're Big Tent.
We can bring together religious organizations that care about the rights of persecuted Christian minorities, and also the importance of cultural heritage preservation, this, ancient Christian heritage, our common heritage international globally, right? It's not just Armenian, it's something that's shared. This is some of the earliest monuments to ancient Christianity in Artsakh and Armenia. So these organizations coming together supporting that. Then you also have the groups that are focused on the rights of POWs and upholding the Geneva Convention. So we're also working on a number of things related to the release of POWs congressionally. We're looking at Magnitsky sanctions when it comes to targeting individuals, and that's something that could be a precedent for other examples of corrupt or human rights abusers who have kind of escaped accountability and justice. We bring together groups that are invested in examining human rights abuse. I mean, Amnesty International being a coalition partner on this effort too is it's very important that these groups are paying attention. So I think even though the return on investment might be more in the long term, we're starting to build a very broad consensus around Armenia and Artsakh and the need to hold Azerbaijan accountable that I think hasn't been done before and could be very important in shaping conversations moving forward.
Excellent. And I'm just curious. It almost felt like a few years ago we would hear or see more Turkish and Azerbaijani lobbying efforts countering us. I mean, since you've been out there, has that been a barrier for you guys? Have you guys come across something that's clearly funded or supported by the other side that still happens?
Azerbaijan has a lobbyist on the Hill. He's paid $166,000 a month. It's obscene the amount of money.
What's his name?
His name's Ezra Friedlander.
Boo.
And but you know what's funny is that I don't think anyone really takes him seriously. There's something here, right? People kind of understand the geopolitical interest. They may be wrong, right? And I may strongly disagree with people who argue that there's a geopolitical interest in U.S. relations with Azerbaijan, right? And we're here to kind of say, no, that's not the case, yeah? But someone who has no dog in the fight, right? Who's not representing U.S. geopolitical interests, who's not a member of the Azerbaijani government, being paid money to defend this horrific regime, most people look at that and say, that is absurd.
They could see past it.
They see right through it. No one's taking that seriously. They know exactly what this person is there to do.
Yeah.
And no one's looking at him and thinking, oh, wow, he's a really serious thought leader in this space. They see someone who's being paid a shitload of money to defend one of the most corrupt, abusive regimes, even discounting the ethnic cleansing of Artsakh. If you just focus on what that regime is doing in its own country, right? You would say, who would defend that regime? Who would come to the US and lobby for China or Russia, right?
Yeah.
It's absurd. So I don't think people really take that seriously.
So maybe that's why it's gone out of the radar, or I haven't really noticed it as much. Maybe it's just not holding the weight or the legitimacy that maybe once these lobbyists held on the Hill, because it doesn't seem like they're taking them seriously.
No, I mean, the bigger obstacle to us is the administration. It's not, and these people are just pandering to the administration's existing thinking on this issue. They're not bringing anything new to the table.
They're just adding a tweet to supporting what they're...
and then they'll say something like, Azerbaijan is a tolerant country, and then a couple of weeks later, the State Department designates Azerbaijan as a country of particular concern for religious freedoms, and that totally disqualifies everything they had to say about that, right?
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, the Armenian communities across the U.S. are, always working on whatever they can to support Armenia. But in Artsakh, what are our action items? What can we do to support the ANC in DC in 2024 in the election? Let's lay it out as to what our agenda or goal is for this year.
I mean, as always, it's become an ANCA rapid responder, right? Sign up for our online advocacy tools because it makes it really simple for you to contact your member of Congress and to get them to support initiatives.
So these calls were like bothering them like this, leaving messages?
I can't tell you the number of times where I've been in meetings with staffers and they'll say, if we heard from constituents, it would be really helpful for us prioritizing this in the office. And it also doesn't really take that much. I spoke to a member who, not even just from the perspective of the person doing it. I mean, I spoke to an office and they were like, it would help if constituents called in. I'm like, look, I can tell you now there are maybe 20 Armenians who live in your district. And they were like, you know what? Honestly,
have all 20 call?
Have them call. And if we're seeing a lot of enthusiasm on this issue, it's going to be hard for us not to respond to it. And it gives us, as staff, a reason for us to elevate it inside the office and prioritize that issue. So people might feel like, is one call going to make a difference? It absolutely can, because when you think about people who are calling in, like it's actually, there's a pretty high threshold for someone to get to the point in which they actually call or email an office. That takes quite a bit of involvement in the civic process to do that.
And you've made it easy for us to do that.
And we've made it as easy as possible. Calling, we have call scripts, we have tweet actions, we have the email actions. So it's very, very easy to do it, and it makes a massive difference. Calling makes a bigger difference.
Interesting.
But everything, calling is really important. But really, every form of online action you can take is extremely helpful. So we have these two a bill and a resolution that are currently our top priorities. We're trying to get members to sign on. So going to the anca.org website and checking out the ways you can get involved and contact those offices is extremely helpful.
What about if you're from the part of the U.S. Without an ANC chapter or with a small Armenian community? Are they? Let's say there's 5 to 10 of them who are interested in doing advocacy for their community there, for the Armenian nation. Can they reach out to ANC and organize a chapter? And
in fact, they are the most impactful and most important activists.
I can imagine.
And we have a mutual friend who lives in Seattle, right? And he's really just like a one-man show. And all it takes is that one person kind of being persistent and reaching out to their members. And so whether it's one person, 2 people, 5, 10, it really doesn't matter. We can play a support role in connecting people to their members, setting up meetings, keeping them in the loop on the work that we're doing. But it's very, very important that if you're, the lone Armenian in Nebraska or Oklahoma or whatever it is, you actually have an outsized role and influence because you are one of a very small community there. And these members aren't hearing from a lot of constituents who have of Armenian descent. So it's actually very, very important for people who don't have that community infrastructure to get connected. And we have the tools. I'll take an hour of my day to just chat with you about what we're doing. We're very ready to work with whoever wants to come to us.
And then with elections, granted, some elections might be already kind of done by the time people hear this, or there might be coming up. But what would be your advice on, how do elections play into supporting your guys' work in DC?
I think continuing to, as a community, be outspoken. I mean, one thing that the Michigan ANC chapter is doing right now is saying vote uncommitted for the Democratic primary, right? To demonstrate frustration with Biden.
I want to do that.
And I mean, obviously that primary is going to be done by the time this comes out. Most will. We're going to be past Super Tuesday, so a lot of the primaries will be done. But at the same time, there will be continuous actions that people can take. We're constantly adapting when it comes to how we approach the election strategy. So hopefully by the time this podcast's out, we have kind of a clear path post primaries, because that's our primary focus right now. While we can kind of influence these initial elections, and then after that fact, we'll have the ability to kind of organize people protests when there are going to be presidential debates, when there are various conventions. These are the opportunities we need to take advantage of.
So I'm working a lot with the Armenian students right now, and the Armenian youth in general. And how can they get more involved and directly kind of support your guys' work in DC? I know you guys have programs out there. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so we have a series of programs throughout the year. There's always something to do in DC. We have our Rising Leaders program over the spring break, 2 sessions in March, which is like a 3-4 day crash course in advocacy. You come to DC, you learn about how the system works. You come to Capitol Hill with me. I'll take you to offices, and you get a chance to first get some firsthand experience speaking to staffers and in some cases members.
What's the age range for that one? I think it's like
that one is.
I think we've seen high school.
It's high school seniors and college, like college freshmen.
I mean, I've seen they go and really like meet these congressmen firsthand and talk to them. I mean, if I remember when I was, by the way, like 16 or 18, I tried applying to my congressman's like internship program. My friend from high school got it. I hate him now. But I feel like if I had a few of these experiences under my belt early on, it would have opened those doors. It helps,
because often what we'll do is, depending on which district you're from, we will get meetings with your Congress members as constituents. So you get to meet face to face with the people who represent you, and it's a great way to get your foot in the door.
Imagine being like, "Hey, I met you that one time. I'm applying to your program."
I've absolutely seen it happen. So,
and the ANC that now you've worked for can then put a word in for you as well.
Exactly, and you don't know how impactful it is, because you have 20 people on the Hill. You can cover every single congressional office in that week, get the word out to plenty of people. It's a lot of fun when you're actually like on the ground doing that work.
And they see youth, they see like constituents like that they don't usually see too. Flying out from California,
flying out from all across the country, and you also get to meet with the Congressional Armenian Staff Association. Many are alumni of our program who can give you tips on how to get jobs on the Hill. So that's the summer. That's the Rising Leaders program. Then over the summer, we have the Leo Sarkisian internship program, which is a 6-week program. You're based in DC, living in the house that the ANCA has in DC, which we put up our program participants free of charge.
And college-aged kids?
And this is college-aged kids. So anyone who's currently studying university and also recent graduates. Yeah, I understand. And so during that program, it's very similar, except you'll be assigned ANC office work as well. So we'll have like some of the interns last time around were working on things like tracking political donations and seeing which groups were giving the most, or looking through the foreign agent registration filings to see who was representing Azerbaijan, who were they having meetings with, so we can kind of get some intel on the conversations that are happening on the Hill. So they did some really meaningful projects. They got to work on publishing articles. They got to and also get a lot of direct Hill experience. I think every week of that program, we took the entire group to Capitol Hill. And after the first week of doing it with me, they were basically doing it on their own. They were visiting offices and speaking to staffers about our legislative priorities. So it's a really cool experience. It's a lot of fun. You build a lot of camaraderie. We've had people from those programs then move on to our Capital Gateway program, which is more for recent college graduates and people who are looking to start their careers in DC.
Nice.
Of the session that we have in DC right now, I think we have a very high success rate. I know 4 recent grads who are now working on the Hill as full-time paid staffers in congressional offices. So
that's awesome.
It's really cool. We kind of use the networks that we have in DC to find you and connect you with the right people. We have networking events. We have seminars on how to write your resume, how to interview, just basic things for gearing you up for professional life. So we have a couple of sessions of that throughout the course of the year. We also have a program geared towards high school students. So high school, I think, juniors and seniors, it's 16 to 18. Yeah. You come for, again, it's like a week-long 5-day program, Monday to Friday, and we take you to the Hill. You do Hill advocacy. You get advocacy training. So you'll come and sit down. I'll pretend to be a Congress member.
Nice.
And you have to convince me to support your initiatives,
That's
right?
Fun.
You also get to meet some Armenian professionals in DC who are working in the comm space or government affairs or academia. Yeah. So it's a great opportunity to get a real feel for the DC environment. And then we also just have rolling internships throughout the year. People who have the capacity to come for a semester and want to spend some time volunteering at the ANC. We have the capacity to do that as well. So a lot of opportunities for people to get directly involved. And I'll say, building up our capacity and ensuring that the next generation of youth advocates are prepared is so important.
It is.
And we really, as an organization, are unique in what we offer. And I always, I will make a point when I bring interns or Gateway Fellows or program participants into meetings with members of Congress or with staffers and explain these are the programs we have on offer. And so many of them are like, wow, I really wish that we had something like that when we graduated from university, because it's so crucial
and unique, and it's something that we've been able to provide our community. And again, like how I said in the beginning, let's get all you political nerds out to DC like you, Alex, and do the good work, because we could use all the manpower we could get out there. And I
mean, if you're considering, for example, studying out in DC or doing a semester over there's a place for you in the ANC.
Right.
There are so many ways in which you can get involved. And you're right. We absolutely need it.
But to think that with the resources that we do currently have and the people that are working, I mean, how much we've accomplished while considering how much we have to do and how much work is left to do. But I want to wish you all the luck and success as once you go back to DC and all the work you guys are doing there. Tell them all we say hello. And we'll be supporting you as best as we can from here, Alex. But thank you very much for stopping by today and talking to us.
Yeah, of course. I mean, one final thought. One final thought is, when Azerbaijan attacked Artsakh and when the entire population was forced from their homes, right? It's very natural that we all feel a sense of despair and disillusionment and frustration, right? We all felt that, and you can't imagine. I work with Aram Hamparian and Yerso, who have been doing this for 30 years. They were there they saw the great successes of the First War. They've been working on persistently on genocide recognition for years. You can only imagine, right, how heartbreaking it is. So we all felt it, right, seeing that happen. But I'm so inspired by their resolve. I'm very grateful to have them as mentors, but also to kind of have that wellspring of optimism that we can make a difference, and that our North Star is Artsakh. Our North Star is making sure that one day Armenians will be able to return to their homes. And we really have, and I sincerely believe this, we have a narrow window to make that difference. So while we are frustrated and despaired and have these natural reactions to what's happened, we have to act now.
We got to ramp it up. We got to go 200%. I know, that's how I feel too. I mean, look, we're stubborn people. I mean, we for 100 years we're still I haven't given up on Western Armenia, so I ain't giving up on Artsakh no matter what. And what I like to tell people is, look, if you're in the desert and you don't see an oasis in front of you, are you going to just stop and sit there and accept your death, or are you going to just keep walking forward, moving forward, and with the potential and the chance and the hope that you will see the oasis there? Either way, you got to walk and try, and we got to do what we can.
You said it right. It took us 100 years to get the genocide recognized. If it takes us 100 years to get Artsakh back,
so be it.
We'll be there. We're stubborn. Yeah. We don't give up without a fight. I wouldn't want to be on the other side of our incredible team and our community.
Yeah,
so
I wouldn't have it any other way.
Absolutely. But Haig, you're doing incredible work here. I think it's very, very important to share these stories and experiences with the community and with a format like this. So looking forward to the season ahead of Haitug Talks.
And thank you for stopping by, Alex.
Anytime.
You're listening to Haitug Talks, the official podcast of the AYF West. My name is Haig Minasyan, and we're just a couple of Armenians talking in the world.
A couple of Armenians talking in the world.